Hey everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with historythroughcards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. So years and years ago, I came across an article of a player that I thought was really impressive. His story, at least, I thought should be shared. And maybe not a lot of people actually know who he is. It is this gentleman right here, Cleo Hill of the St. Louis Hawks. This is his only card that I'm aware of. It's a 1961 Essex Meets Hawks, and there's only 13 cards to the set. However, you're never going to complete the entire set. The reason why is because the card of Shahugo Green is, I think, maybe one of a kind. I've never actually seen this card before. I've heard about it. It's it's kind of like a Bigfoot story, and people say, "Oh, I saw Bigfoot." Oh yeah, where's your photograph? Where's your proof? I saw a Shahugo Green 1961 Hawks card. Oh yeah, where's your proof? And so it was kind of a legend for a long time. One of those old wives of the hobby tale. I did actually see a copy of this card online, so I'm pretty sure it exists. They say that there's actually one card known and is a printer's proof, and it looks something like this. So that's pretty impressive. The card actually, who knows what it would go for today. I'm not even sure if it's sold, if it has recently. I'm not even sure how much it would go for because, again, it's a one of one. They say, though, that there's maybe five copies known, kind of like the 1963 Pepsi John Bates. If you guys know about that card, there's only five of those cards, and he was on um, the Houston Colt 45s, the Pepsi. So that card is extremely rare too, and both of these cards actually they don't command nearly what the T206 Honus Wagner would, but they're far rarer than Wagner or Planck or even the Slow Joe Doyle, which just sold from the 1909 T206 set. And I think in that case, that card actually went for over a million, I think like 1,000,005 or something like that. That's insane to me. Slow Joe Doyle, okay, but that card itself has a really great history. However, getting back to this gentleman here, if you haven't seen these cards, they are really slick. At least I think black and white. The photography is sharp and it's fantastic. I'll show you the back, just in case you haven't seen. You could actually easily pass one of these by and not know what it is because there's nothing that says Essex Meats on here. But today I wanted to get to an article on Cleo Hill. And as I said before, I was a kid when I heard this name. And the set is something that you guys can complete, I think, fairly affordable. I think so. I'm not entirely sure these days because prices are so damn rough. When I was a kid, these cards you could get for like 20 bucks each, 10, 20 bucks. I got this card fairly cheap back in the day. It's graded, and I got it at auction. The Bob Pettit in the set is one that I'm missing, and I love Bob Pettit. That guy is he's so underrated as a player. It's ridiculous, and both of those guys, Pettit and actually I think most of these guys in this set are in the Flair set as well. I'm not entirely sure why Shahugo Green is actually not in this set. A lot of people say actually that that card was pulled from production, so there's a problem with the contract. Flair probably had it first, and they probably said, we're going to sue you guys, something along those lines. We're not entirely sure what happened. Again, Cleo Hill, this is his only card that I'm aware of. But I want to get to this article, and I think you guys are going to have a very interesting conversation afterwards about this among yourselves and maybe with me too. As always, leave a comment and subscribe afterwards. I would greatly appreciate that. But here's the article, and I'll catch you on the flip side. This is from the Asbury Park Press, March 7th, 1993, Asbury Park, New Jersey. Cleo Hill, Forgotten Legend by Bill Handelman. Cleo Hill had been sitting in his tiny government drab office, talking for a good while already, answering questions about the old days, telling stories that might have sounded fantastic to someone who had never heard his name mentioned among the legends of early above the rim basketball. With no particular emotion, he talked of once blocking Wayne Embry's shot and Elgin Baylor's and Bill Russell's. Nobody blocked Russell's shot. It didn't matter that Cleo Hill was only 6'1". He could leap. He could just come right out and told you so as a matter of simple, unpretentious fact. But you already knew this to be true from all the other accounts. The only thing that was remotely surprising was the tone, the matter-of-fact tone. Then suddenly he's up out of his seat, moving from behind the desk, maneuvering to stake out his claim in the paint, and now the tone is somehow different. This is how he'd block the shot of Harry Gallatin, he says, laughing a hearty laugh, extending his arm as far out as it would go, straining against an imaginary ball, against some ill-fated shot that was aborted some 30 years ago in some training camp incident that no one would remember after all these years. No one other than Cleo Hill, that is. Harry the Horse Gallatin was a new coach in St. Louis when the Hawks set out to prepare for the NBA's 1962-63 season. He wouldn't last long, but then again, who did? Working for Ben Kerner. Kerner, the owner of the Hawks, was a powerful man in NBA circles back then, fickle, too. The George Steinbrenner of his day, as Hill put it, went through coaches left and right. Anyway, Gallatin had just retired as a player after 9 seasons in New York and one in Detroit, which meant he was still game. So there he was in the thick of the action at camp, fanning one way and wheeling the other, looking to take the same shot Hill had watched him take 1,001 times when Harry the Horse was with the New York Knicks. Only the coach didn't know Cleo was from Newark and that he had a good memory. So now he's surprised, Gallatin, and embarrassed, and angry, and as if that weren't enough, he has somehow cut his lip, and there's blood trickling out the corner of his mouth. Also, Harry the Horse is well aware of the fact that this kid who just made a fool out of him is not exactly a regular dinner companion of Ben Kerner's, and that his name isn't on the marquee outside Kiel Auditorium either. How good are you at teaching? Hill remembers Gallatin asking him, his mouth still bleeding. Pretty good, said Cleo, not knowing exactly what he meant by this. Well, Gallatin, we're going to let you teach. And that was the end of Cleo Hill's career in the National Basketball Association. He was 24 years old. Cleo Hill went from Southside High School in Newark to Winston-Salem Teachers College, then an all-black school in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There he played for the legendary coach Clarence Big House Gaines. Gaines, who only recently announced his retirement, has called Hill, quote, the most complete player I ever had, which would include Earl Monroe, the Pearl himself. But they were two different kinds of players. Gaines says, quote, one, Hill, was a power guard, the other was a finesse guard. If I had to pick one, though, well, I couldn't. Hill, the extraordinary leaper from Newark, was drafted by St. Louis in the first round of the 1961 draft. That was 6 years before the Pearl came along, and some would say light years before the game caught up to Cleo Hill. At the time, there was no question he was destined for superstardom in the NBA, recalls Billy Packer, the basketball analyst for CBS. We're not talking about some nice rookie here. We're talking about Michael. Michael? Cleo was Michael 33 years ago. At 6'1", he did the things Michael Jordan does, only without the benefit of having Julius Erving in between. And in one year, he goes from that to a guy who's out of the league? Packer still wonders about this. Actually, he's been wondering about Cleo Hill ever since that Friday night long ago when he hitchhiked across town from Wake Forest to see this kid play at Winston-Salem. Packer was a sophomore and a star at Wake by then, and as such he was well known in that neck of the woods. We'd get two-thirds of the front page of the sports section in the Winston-Salem Journal, he recalls, whereas Cleo's team would get one paragraph on page 3. But as a fellow player, Packer had heard players always hear. So he thumbs a ride across town and buys himself a ticket to see what all the noise is about. I was the only white guy in the place, Packer recalls. House Gaines sees me and says, "Boy, you better sit down over there with us," and I wind up sitting at the end of the bench. Anyway, they tap off and Cleo gets the ball, and first thing he does is take this 30-foot set shot and misses everything by 3 feet. And I'm not believing I came all this way over here to see this. I'm thinking, no wonder nobody writes about these guys. Over the next couple of minutes, the wonder returned. A right-handed hook here, a left-handed hook there, a couple of block shots, a steal, and all of a sudden Mr. Wake Forest is saying to himself, "What in the world is this? I've never seen anything like it." So I go back to see Bones McKinney, our coach, and I tell him, "You've got to see this guy." Cleo was head and shoulders over anything we had in the ACC. Lee Schaefer from North Carolina was a number 1 draft pick for Syracuse that year, but he wasn't in Cleo's league. Al Attles, who played at North Carolina AT&T and went on to have a nice career in the NBA, he was no Cleo Hill. We went to the Final Four and never played against anybody like him. And we played that Ohio State team with John Havlicek and Jerry Lucas. Earl Monroe was obviously the sensational player, a Hall of Fame player, and Earl was ahead of his time too, which was 6 years behind Cleo. But if you said to me who was the better, Cleo or Earl, I'd have to say Cleo. We're talking about a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, yet hardly anyone under the age of 50 has ever heard of Cleo Hill. Not that this keeps him up at nights, not that he goes around bitterly denouncing those who may have deprived him of his fame. He doesn't do any such thing, which is another source of wonder, maybe even a source of inspiration. If he has any regrets, says James Thomas, he conceals it well. Thomas went to North Carolina Central while Hill was at Winston-Salem. They've known each other for 30 years, now a supervisor for New Jersey Transit. Thomas sees him all the time. He went and watched Cleo play in Winston-Salem. Now he comes in and watches him coach in Newark. For the past 20 years, Hill has been the basketball coach at Essex County College. For the past 14, he has served as both coach and athletic director. Calling him the head coach would be kind of gratuitous, considering he hasn't had an assistant in 10 years. This does not seem to have much hampered the program much. However, over the years, Hill's teams have a 423-116 record. This season, the Wolverines finished up at 21-4 after losing to Camden in the National Junior College Athletic Association Region 19 championship game last weekend. One of his teams once scored 210 points in a game against Englewood Cliffs. Another, the 1977-78 team that went 31-1, beat Ocean County College by the equally outrageous score of 8-4. James Thomas saw both those games. He's there for most of the Essex County games. Gets to his share of games in the summer too to keep up with the local playground wizards. But in all his years of following the game, he has yet to see a player the likes of Cleo Hill. If he had come 2 years after he did, he'd have been one of the all-time guards, says Thomas. I'm serious. You'd have to see it to believe it. I witnessed it with my own 2 eyes. And nobody ever talks about him. You never hear him mentioned. He's just one before his time, I guess. Before he was even in high school, Cleo Hill was already working on the serious reputation. Bill Rafferty, now a round-the-dial color commentator, remembers him from the old Littleton Avenue Boys Club. First time Rafferty laid eyes on him, Cleo was in the 8th grade, doing stuff 8th graders just didn't do. Later, when they were both in college, Rafferty remembers playing in the same summer leagues with Hill. Watching him in those days, says Rafferty, I knew right then I wasn't going to be playing above the rim. He was like a miniature Connie Hawkins. He did a lot of the Jordan-esque type of things we see today. He had flair. He could beat you inside. He could take you outside. He could handle. He could block shots. Rafferty also remembers Tom Gola telling me he couldn't believe how good this guy was. That was after Cleo had taken his game to a league that may not have been quite ready for him, or was it a team that wasn't quite ready? St. Louis Hawks won their first and only NBA championship in 1958. They were the last all-white team to win one. Bob Pettit, a deadly shooter, was the star of that team. He scored 50 points in the final game of the championship series against the Boston Celtics. Alex Henham was the coach. He had replaced Red Holtzman, who was fired by Ben Kerner the year before. The year before that, Kerner made a deal with Red Auerbach, obtaining two key pieces for his championship team, Cliff Hagan and Easy Ed Macaulay, in exchange for some rookie named Bill Russell. The year after they won the title, the Hawks added Clyde Levelette. At this juncture, the team was finally beginning to pay off for Kerner, who was rumored to have hawked his house to make a go at it in the NBA. And since Pettit, Hagan, and Lavalette were the offense, basically they became known as the untradables or the unmatchables or simply the Big Three. They brought Kerner out of the poorhouse, says Hill. I think he left indebted to them. Whatever, into the mix walks Paul Seymour, a tough young coach who was a tough little guard in Syracuse for 13 years. And Seymour wants to draft this Hill kid out of Winston-Salem, which is fine by the general manager, Marty Blake, so they draft Cleo. One of the greatest players I ever drafted, and I drafted a lot of them, says Blake, who has his own scouting service in Atlanta these days. Great first step, unlimited range, and they had the three-point shot back then. If they had the three-point shot back then, he'd have been a 50% guy. And he was quick. I mean, he was a speed demon. That was the problem. Cleo was quick, and we weren't. That was the year Lenny Wilkins went into the service and Levelette and Larry Faust both broke a leg. It was the only year I didn't make the playoffs, and I was 15 years with the Hawks. But if Lenny hadn't gone into the Army and Levelette and Faust hadn't gotten hurt, Cleo would probably still be playing. Seymour remembers things differently. Then again, you get fired 11 games into your first season in a new town. That could color your recollections. On the other hand, Hill seems to remember things much the same way Seymour does. Quote, I was told to bench Cleo or I'd be fired, says Seymour. I told Mr. Kerner I wasn't going to bench him because he was our best player, so he fired me. In the St. Louis papers the next day, Seymour was quoted as saying, It's the first time I've been fired and I find it isn't so bad after all. I'd rather lose my job doing what I think is right. Asked about this recently, Seymour said his feelings hadn't changed since that day back in 1961. Cleo, I thought was the answer, he says now. I thought he might have been a great guard, and I drafted Hal Greer and Dick Barnett, so I think I know something about guards. Cleo was a nice kid, too. He was laid back, and he was always very humble around me. He was finding his way. Being a black kid in St. Louis back then, that wasn't so hot. But that's not why Hill was gone after only one season. Had nothing to do with the color of his skin. The Hawks had already had black players, Wilkins, Shahugo Green, Woody Salisbury. No, it was something else. Kidd was sensational during the 1961 exhibition season, a rookie averaging 17 points while playing just half a game. Wow. The papers in St. Louis were writing stuff like, quote, his leaps would embarrass a gazelle, unquote. Then the season opens and the kid's starting here scores 26 against Cincinnati, and everybody's happy, right? Wrong. Those points the rookie was scoring, they belonged to somebody else. In that league at the time, you had to score points, says Hill. Today, a negotiator can sit there and say, well, he got this many rebounds and he blocked that many shots and so forth. But back then, it was just how many points you scored, and then you scored a lot of them. You got a commercial. Pettit had his, and Hagen did one for the Greasy Kid stuff. It didn't matter. If you were taking points away from a man, you were taking bread off his table. Paul Seymour wasn't so sure it didn't matter black or white. The grapevine was the big three sort of blackballed him, said Seymour, or whiteballed him, as the case may be, as he had told the reporters the day he got fired. My only gripe is the way they boycotted the kid. But neither Seymour nor Hill could see much sense in getting all worked up over this thing after all these years, and Bob Pettit, for one, says he really didn't remember all that much about Cleo Hill. Sorry. My impressions of Cleo were very favorable, Pettit said from his office in New Orleans, where he works as an investment consultant, but I really didn't remember details over the years. All of these things blend together. Even games into the 1961-62 season, the Hawks fired Paul Seymour, named Bob Pettit interim coach, and benched Cleo Hill. So much for the Hall of Fame. Then the Hawks hire Fuzzy Levine to be their coach, and Fuzzy calls to ask Seymour for advice, and Seymour tells him, you can't win without the kid. Then later on that season, the Hawks fire Levine, and Fuzzy says to me, I didn't believe you, but you were right. Seymour recalls. In the fall, Cleo blocks his new coach's shot. It was as good an excuse as any, Hill figures now, looking back on it. So much for the NBA. They ganged up on me, said Cleo, so I must have been pretty good, 'cause they wouldn't do that to an average player. That makes me feel good. Besides, life after the NBA wasn't so bad. That year he wound up playing for the Philadelphia Tapers of the American Basketball League. The small gyms they played in were generally empty, but that was all right. He was making $10,000 a year. Good money in those days, and $500 more than the Hawks had been paying him. Besides, Connie Hawkins played in that league, Bill Bridges too, so how bad could it be? The ABL folded the next year, and Hill moved on to the old Eastern League. 5 days a week he worked in Newark as a recreation director and substitute teacher. On weekends he played for the Trenton Colonials. The pay was good, and the crowds were bigger than as okay as Cleo remembers it. But after 6 years of bumping along from Trenton to the New Haven Elms to the Scranton Miners, he decided enough was enough and went to work full-time teaching. His first job was at Lincoln Elementary School in East Orange. About 2 years later, Essex County College got itself a coach. He can look at you one time and tell you what you need to learn, says one of his current players, Alan Richardson. Then he teaches you. That's what he is, a teacher, a pretty good one too. Just like he told Harry the Horse Gallatin he could be that time back in the auditorium of 1962. As for fame, obviously Cleo Hill has managed just fine without it. There is no rancor, unless it's mighty well concealed, but it's still very nice every now and then, like the time one of his former players came back to see him, and the kid says to his coach in Virginia, was talking, saying stuff like Cleo Hill. You played for Cleo Hill? Sure, I know him. He used to play the game the way Michael Jordan plays the game. Mr. Hill said, the kid, Derek Johnson, you never told us. I thought that was really interesting. I'm not entirely sure what the race relationship was with the St. Louis Hawks back then. As I said, it was an all-white team, but you had really a lot of, I think 90% of all of the league was white. I don't know if that played any role in this. As far as Cleo Hill is concerned, it didn't. Um, and I'm going to go with his recollections on this. He has passed on, I believe, in 2018 or 2017. His memory still lives, and it lives on in his card right here, as does a lot of players who have passed on. That's the one thing I like about card collecting, in fact, is that every player has a story, and sometimes you just have to dig. What happens usually is that these stories get forgotten over time, or they're not told to other generations like mine. So we don't know about them, and then that's how a lot of these players end up getting forgotten, or just some collector coming along and saying, "Who's Cleo Hill?" And I don't like that kind of stuff. I really don't. I like to talk about the history of the hobby and the players in it. And like I said, everyone has a story to tell. And sometimes they're not around to tell these stories. And again, they get forgotten over time. And much like the hobby history itself gets forgotten as well. And if it's not talked about or it's not written down, who's going to tell it, right? So guys, I really thank you for stopping by, as always. Let me know what you think about Cleo Hill here, or the 1961 Essex Meets cards. If you have any, if you have a favorite player from the Hawks, let me know. I'd always love to hear what you guys have to say. And until next time, I will talk to you later. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye.